The sagas speak of a man who dared sail beyond the edge of the known world. A son of exile, a seeker of destiny. Leif Erikson. Was he the true discoverer of America, centuries before Columbus? Or just a Norse legend, born of firelight and myth? Tonight, we unravel the truth behind the legend. The wind howled across the frozen coast, carrying with it the cries of a people whose lives were bound to the sea. In the far north, where sunlight lingered only as a pale ghost in the sky, stories were not written on parchment but carved into memory by firelight. It was in such halls that the sagas were born, tales of gods, monsters, and men who dared to sail beyond the edges of the known world. And among these stories, one name would emerge, whispered with awe and uncertainty: Leif, son of Eric the Red. The world that shaped him was not one of peace. His father had been cast out of Iceland for bloodshed, driven into exile until he found a harsh new home on the icy land they called Greenland. Eric the Red's fury was legendary, his hands as red with violence as with the iron ore of the earth. Yet his son was different. Leif carried in him a silence, an inward storm. He was broad-shouldered like his father, but where Eric's eyes blazed with fire, Leif's carried something colder: questions, doubts, and perhaps even dreams too fragile to be spoken aloud. Around him, the world was shifting. Old gods still held sway in Greenland's halls, but whispers of a new faith traveled with sailors and traders: Christianity, the faith of the southern kingdoms. Some said it promised redemption, others said it stripped away the honor of the sagas. Leif felt the pull of both, trapped between Thor's hammer and the cross, uncertain which path was truly his. On storm nights, when the sea roared like a beast outside his father's hall, Leif would sit apart, watching the fire's glow dance across the faces of men who lived for conquest. They spoke of raids, of silver, of glory earned by the sword. But Leif's gaze always drifted toward the shadows, where an old man sat quietly, his foster father, Turkur. Strange in his manners, speaking with an accent unlike the Norse, Turkur had always been something of a mystery. Some called him a foreign thrall, others a guardian. To Leif, he was a tether, the one man who did not see him as simply Eric's son. It was Turkur who whispered of lands beyond the horizon. Not in sagas, not in boastful feasts, but in quiet moments by the shore. He spoke of warmth, of green fields untouched by frost, of fruits sweeter than mead. Leif listened, caught between disbelief and longing, as though Turkur described a dreamland carved from the god's own imagination. But the sea was no dream. It was a graveyard, and every Viking knew it. When Leif first set sail, still young and untested, the ocean revealed its cruelty. Waves like mountains battered their ship, winds tore at their sails, and men clung to the oars with bloodied hands. Salt burned in Leif's eyes, his body shaking as the ship lurched toward ruin. In those moments, with death as close as the water crashing over the prow, he learned the truth. Courage was not the absence of fear, but the act of rowing into the storm despite it. That night, when they returned half-drowned and half-broken, the hall erupted in laughter and jeers. Leif the Lucky, they called him, mocking his survival as mere chance. Yet the name stuck, and with it a shadow of destiny. Leif himself said nothing, only watching the firelight, as though listening to some voice beyond the noise. The sagas would later call him bold, fearless, even chosen. But history tells us little of certainty. Was Leif driven by hunger for land, by loyalty to his father's blood, or by the restless whispers of Turkur? The truth lies hidden, scattered like bones across the centuries. What is known is this: Leif Erikson did not remain a man content with Greenland's icy shores. The silence inside him, the questions, the restless pull of horizons unseen, all of it drove him toward something greater. While others sought plunder, Leif sought something harder to define, a place beyond the sagas themselves. On nights when the fire cracked low, he would rise and step outside, his breath a ghost in the frozen air. He would stare at the horizon, the line where sea met sky, and imagine what lay beyond. Was it another barren shore, Another place of exile like Greenland? Or was it the land of Turker's tales, a place that could reshape his fate, free from his father's shadow? The answer lay across the dark waters, waiting. And when the time came, Leif Erikson would follow that call, not as Eric's son, not as a Viking bound to his father's rage, but as something else. Something no saga could fully capture, and no historian could fully prove. A man caught between truth and legend, ready to carve his own name into the uncertain edge of the world. The sea stretched out in every direction, an endless skin of iron-gray water beneath a sky the color of ash. Each wave rose like a living beast, crashing against the longship's sides, testing the resolve of every man aboard. Oars bit into the sea with a rhythm that was more desperate than disciplined, and the sails strained like wings against the screaming wind. This was no gentle voyage. It was the crucible through which Leif Ericson's name would be forged. Greenland was shrinking behind him, not only in distance but in memory. Ahead lay something undefined, something promised by whispers and sagas, lands beyond the edge of maps where opportunity waited or ruin. Leif stood at the prow, water streaming down his cloak, gripping the carved dragon's head as if he could force the horizon to reveal its secrets. Behind him, the men muttered, fear dripping from their voices like rain from their beards. They called him Leif the Lucky, but here, in the storm's fury, luck felt thin as a thread. Nature tested them first. Icebergs, towering and silent, drifted like pale ghosts through the fog. To strike one meant death, yet the fog swallowed sight, reducing the world to the groan of the ship's timbers and the rush of water. Then came the cold, cruel and endless, sinking its claws into the marrow of every sailor. Fingers stiffened around oars, lips cracked and bled, and still Leif commanded them onward. This was not his father's rage guiding him, nor the fire of a conqueror. It was something quieter, a conviction that somewhere out there lay a truth that needed to be found. But the sea was not the only enemy. Doubt festered among the crew. Men whispered that the voyage was cursed, that no such lands existed beyond Greenland, that Leif was chasing ghosts. Some said Eric the Red's blood carried madness, and perhaps the sun now bore it as well. One night, as the fire sputtered in the ship's iron brazier, a man challenged him, eyes hard with fear disguised as courage. We should turn back before we all drown. No land is worth dying in a storm. Leif's reply was not shouted, but spoken with a stillness that carried more weight than rage. If you wish to see Greenland again, take the oars. Row until you find it. But if you stay on this ship, you will row where I command. I would rather die seeking than live chained to fear. The man looked away, and the crew fell silent. From that night onward, their doubts remained unspoken, though not forgotten. It was Turker, his foster father, who gave the men reason to hope when the sea at last revealed land. The coastline rose jagged and barren, marked by stones and ice, a place they called Helgeland, the land of flat rock. There was no welcome here, no promise of survival. Still, they pressed onward, and after days of sailing they found Markland, forests thick with timber, rivers wide as serpents. The men hungered for warmth and rest, but Leif's eyes kept searching the horizon. He knew this was not the place. Then, at last, came the land that would haunt sagas for centuries, Vinland. Here, the air carried a softness unknown in Greenland, and the grass rolled across the hills like green fire. Streams ran fresh and clear, and in the woods grew fruits unlike any they had seen before. Grapes, Turker claimed, his voice breaking into excitement, his foreign tongue spilling out words the crew barely understood. They laughed, calling him drunk or mad, yet the vines were real, heavy with promise. The men shouted with joy, their weariness forgotten, as if they had stumbled into a land blessed by the gods. But even paradise carried shadows. The forests whispered with unseen voices, the crack of branches not made by Norse feet. Strange markings were found on trees, and once, arrows of bone whistled through the air, striking the earth near their camp. They glimpsed figures at the edge of the woods, dark-eyed, swift, vanishing like smoke before pursuit. The sagas would later call them Skraelings, fierce and foreign, defenders of their homeland. Leif felt no hunger for conquest, but he knew too well that men driven by fear often struck first. One night, when the moon spilled silver over the camp, he sat apart with Turkar. "Do you believe this place is real?" Leif asked, voice low. "Not just a tale that will fade like mist?" Turkar's eyes glimmered in the firelight, his face carved with lines of age and secrets. "The land is real, my son. But truth and legend are twins. One survives in memory, the other in stone. You must decide which brother you will serve." Those words stayed with Leif as the days bled into weeks. The men grew restless, torn between the bounty of Vinland and the dangers lurking in its shadows. Some demanded they stay, build halls, claim the land as their own. Others longed to return to Greenland with tales of discovery. Leif bore the weight of every choice, knowing that whichever path he chose, history would remember it in ways he could not control. The sagas would call him bold, call him lucky, call him the discoverer of a new world. Yet in the silent hours before dawn, Leif knew another truth, that discovery was not conquest, that leadership was not inherited, and that even the greatest voyage left as many questions as answers. And still the horizon beckoned, whispering of conflict yet to come, and of a reckoning between the man Leif was and the legend the world would make of him. The ocean no longer roared with rage. It whispered. The waves rolled soft against the longship's hull, as if the sea itself bowed in recognition of what had been done. Leif Erikson stood at the stern, his eyes fixed on the horizon where Vinland faded into the mist. Behind him, the men murmured, some with relief, others with regret. They had touched a land rich with promise, fields green even in the cold, forests endless, rivers deep, vines heavy with fruit. Yet they left it behind, as though the gods had granted them only a glimpse, never the right to stay. In his heart, Leif knew why. Vinland was not a gift freely given. The forests had eyes. The arrows that had hissed from the shadows spoke louder than words. This land belonged to others. The sagas would paint his arrival as destiny, but to those who lived there first, he was not a chosen discoverer. He was an intruder. And Leif, unlike so many of his kin, could feel the weight of that truth. Still, the men would call him Leif the Lucky. He had brought them back alive, their ship loaded with timber, stories, and memories. Fortune seemed to follow him like a shadow. Yet Leif knew that luck was a fragile shield. It had not been luck that kept them alive through storms. It was resolve. It was Turkar's wisdom. It was the crew's stubborn will. The sagas might strip those truths away, but in Leif's memory, they burned clear as fire. Back in Greenland, his return was greeted with awe. To stand before men who had known nothing but ice and stone, and to tell them of warm lands across the sea, was to shake their very sense of the world. Some believed him. Others accused him of weaving fables. The skalds, hungry for stories, turned his words into verses, their voices rising in smoky halls until even the truth was hard to hear beneath the song. Already, Leif could feel himself being reshaped, carved into something larger than he truly was. But history, unlike the sagas, is not sung from memory. Centuries later, men would dig into the earth at a place called Lance aux Meadows, uncovering traces of Norse dwellings. The bones of houses, the iron nails, the remains of a forge, all whispering that Vikings had indeed crossed the sea. Archaeology lent weight to the sagas, but never fully confirmed their every word. Did Leif truly step onto North American soil, centuries before Columbus? Or did his story grow like vines in the telling, rooted in truth but tangled with legend? The question haunted him even in life. Was he truly a discoverer, or simply a wanderer guided by winds and chance? Did he carve his own path, or was he merely the shadow of his father, Eric the Red, given a new stage on which to stand? He did not know. Perhaps no man ever truly knows the shape of his own legacy. There were nights when Leif sat alone, staring at the fire, hearing Turkar's words echo in his mind. Truth and legend are twins. One survives in memory, the other in stone. Leif had touched both, and he understood that one day he would vanish, leaving only stories and fragments for others to argue over. But as the fire burned low, he felt no despair. To live at all was to become a story. And some stories, if carried far enough, become eternal. The sagas would call him bold, fearless, touched by fate. Historians would call him a figure of uncertainty, a puzzle pieced together from shards of truth. To us, across the centuries, he remains both, a man and a myth, standing on the shifting line between what was real and what was dreamed. And so we are left with a question, one that lingers like the salt of the sea on the lips. Was Leif Erikson truly the first European to set foot on America, or is he only the creation of sagas sung by firelight? Perhaps the answer lies not in choosing one over the other, but in recognizing that both truths exist, that a man once sailed into the unknown, and that in sailing, he became something greater than himself. His ship fades into mist, the dragon-headed prow cutting silently across the sea. The waves close behind him, erasing his passage, but the story remains. A man caught between two worlds, truth and legend. And now the story is yours to carry. What do you believe? Was Leif Erikson the true discoverer of America, or just a name carved by sagas into myth? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and if you want more epic tales of Vikings, history, and legends, don't forget to like, subscribe, and join us on the next voyage into the past.